He was the richest man in the territory, and he chose to shovel manure for a woman who would have spit in his face if she'd known his name. Cole Mercer didn't come to Ash Creek to fall in love. He came because he'd already won, and winning had cost him everything worth keeping. The land syndicate he built from nothing had swallowed 47 ranches across 3 counties. Families. Legacies. Gone. And the 48th? It belonged to Eliza Thornton, the one woman who refused to break. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay with me, because this one doesn't end the way you think. The horse showed up limping. That was the first thing Eliza Thornton noticed. Not the man in the saddle, not the dust cloud trailing behind him on the dry road that cut through the southern end of her property, but the animal's uneven gait, the way its left foreleg came down a half beat slower than the others. She had her father's eyes for horses. She couldn't help it. She was on the porch pulling her boots on when she saw him coming up the long road toward the house. It was just past 6 in the morning, the sky still that pale, washed-out gray that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to be blue. She'd already been awake for an hour, which was late by her standards. The water pump on the east trough had been making a sound the night before that she didn't like, a hollow, sucking kind of knock, and she wanted to get to it before the heat arrived and made everything worse. The rider stopped about 30 yards from the porch gate. He didn't call out, just sat there on the limping horse, one hand resting on the saddle horn, waiting. Like he had the patience of a man who'd learned the hard way that announcing yourself too loudly in unfamiliar territory was a good way to get shot at. Eliza finished pulling on her second boot, stood up, and walked to the edge of the porch. She didn't reach for the rifle leaning against the wall behind her. Not yet. "Road's public," she called out. "But my gate isn't." He took his hat off. It was a gesture so old-fashioned and deliberate that for a second she almost laughed. "Yes, ma'am." His voice carried across the yard without strain, not loud, just clear. "I'm not looking for trouble. Looking for work, if there's any to be had." She studied him from where she stood. Difficult to put a precise age on him from this distance. Somewhere past 30, she guessed. Maybe a few years deep into his 30s. His coat was good quality, or had been once. Now it was road-beaten and dust gray. His boots were worse. The horse, despite its limp, was a fine animal underneath the trail grime. That combination, good horse, bad boots, told her something, though she wasn't sure what. "What kind of work?" she asked. "Whatever kind needs doing." She crossed her arms. "That's a real broad answer. You probably have a real broad list of problems." It wasn't arrogant the way he said it, just matter of fact, which was somehow more irritating and more honest at the same time. Eliza came down off the porch and walked toward the gate, stopping on her side of it. Up close, she could see the exhaustion in his face. Not dramatic, theatrical exhaustion, just the quiet, settled kind that comes from too many nights sleeping on hard ground. His eyes were gray and direct, and they didn't dart around the property the way a scavenger's eyes did, cataloging and calculating. He was just looking at her. "Name," she said. "A beat, just slightly too long." "Cole," he said. "Cole Morgan." She noticed the pause, filed it away. "You got experience with ranch work, Cole Morgan?" "I know water systems, fencing, I've handled cattle, horses, some light carpentry." He glanced down at his animal. "I also know this horse needs a day of rest and some attention to that left foreleg before she's any use to anyone, including me." That honesty, unprompted about a weakness, landed differently than she expected. "Broke?" she asked, meaning the leg. "Stone bruise, I think. She needs the hoof packed and rest." Eliza reached over the gate and laid her hand on the horse's nose. The mare shifted, then settled. She ran her fingers down the foreleg, felt the warmth radiating from just above the hoof. Stone bruise was probably right. Not career-ending, but serious enough that a careless owner would have kept riding her anyway. "I've got a full-time hand," Eliza said, straightening up. "Had one. He left 3 weeks ago to follow his brother to the Silverfields outside Cutter. I've got a neighbor's boy who comes twice a week, but he's 12 and his mother's about to have another baby, so he's not reliable." She looked at Cole steadily. "I can't pay much." "How much is not much?" She told him the number. She watched his face for the wince, for the negotiation, for the calculation. None of it came. "That's fine," he said, which was, again, irritating, because it suggested he didn't need the money, and a man who didn't need money but wanted work had reasons she couldn't see yet. "There's a bunkhouse," she said. "One room, clean enough. You cook for yourself or you eat what I put on the table, whichever. I'm not running a hotel." She unlatched the gate. "Your horse goes in the near paddock. I'll show you where the packing materials are." "Thank you, ma'am." "My name is Eliza Thornton," she said, the way her father had always said it, like it was a statement of fact that came with a history attached. "You don't need to call me ma'am. You work here. You call me Eliza." He nodded once. "Eliza." "The pump on the east trough is making a noise I don't like," she said, already turning back toward the house. "After you've settled the horse, that's where we start." The pump was worse than she'd thought. Cole crouched beside it in the morning heat, had it mostly disassembled within 20 minutes. He worked without commentary, which she appreciated, though she kept waiting for him to ask her for tools or instructions or to tell her he needed a part she didn't have. He didn't ask for much. He used what was there, improvised where he had to, and put it back together with a quiet, concentrated efficiency that reminded her a little of watching her father work, the economy of motion, of someone who had done physical labor long enough that it had become a kind of thinking. The pump ran clean by mid-morning. He tested it 3 times, running water through, listening to each cycle. "There's a crack in the intake sleeve, Yika," he told her, wiping his hands on a cloth. "I patched it for now, but it'll need replacing within the month or it'll split again. Can you make the replacement?" He looked at the sleeve, turned it in his hands. "I can try. Might be faster to ride into town for the part." "Town is half a day each way," she said. "Try first." He did. It took him 2 more days, working evenings after the regular work was done, using scrap materials from the barn and a technique she'd never seen before that involved a particular wrapping method around a fitted pipe segment. It wasn't pretty, but it held. She tested it hard, ran water through it for a full hour, watching for any weep or drip. Nothing. She didn't compliment him. She said, "The south fence line has 3 sections down. Coyote pressure, I think, maybe a deer hit. I need it back up before I move the cattle." "I'll need wire and posts," he said. "Barn. Back left corner. I'll ride out with you to show you which sections." The south fence line took 4 days. This was not because Cole worked slowly, it was because of what they found on the second day out. A section of fence that hadn't just fallen, but had been cut. Clean cuts, 3 of them in a row, at a height that ruled out animal damage. Eliza crouched down and looked at the wire ends for a long time without saying anything. Cole stood a few feet back and let her look. "Someone did this deliberately," she said at last. It wasn't a question. "Yes, recently." He crouched beside her. The wire ends hadn't oxidized much. "Within the week, I'd say. Maybe less." Eliza stood up. She put her hands on her hips and looked out across the south pasture, toward the tree line that marked where her land ended and the open range began. Her face was a controlled, careful kind of expressionless that was not the same as calm. "This isn't the first time," she said. "Last spring, a gate on the north side was found open 3 mornings in a row. I lost 4 head before I figured out it wasn't a latch problem." She looked at Cole. "I reported it. Sheriff said it was probably someone passing through." Cole looked at the cuts in the wire again and said nothing. "You don't think it was someone passing through," she said. "I think passing through people cut wire sometimes, but usually not in a neat row like that. That's a man who knew what he was doing and why." She nodded slowly. "I'll repair it," she said, "but I want the new post set deeper on this section, and I want an extra strand at the top." "I can do that." They worked the rest of that day mostly in silence, which was a particular kind of silence that had content in it, a shared understanding of the thing that had just been said without words. Someone was applying pressure to her land. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was the quiet, patient kind of pressure that smart men used when they wanted something and had learned that visible aggression created witnesses. Eliza had known this for 2 years. She just hadn't been able to prove it. The bunkhouse was a single room with a cot, a small iron stove, and 1 window that faced east. Cole had slept in worse places. He'd slept in places that cost $50 a night that felt worse than this room, though he wouldn't have been able to explain exactly why to anyone who asked. He lay on the cot that fourth night, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling, the horses shifting in the barn, the distant call of something in the dark hills, the creak of the windmill that needed its upper bearing greased, and he thought about the fact that he was here at all. He had a house in Crestfield, 3 stories, built by an architect he'd brought in from the east, with a staff of 7 and a view of the river that had been described in a newspaper as commanding. He had an office on the top floor of the Mercer building in the same city, with a desk that had cost more than most men in Ash Creek made in a year. He had accounts in 4 banks, interests in 6 mining operations, a railroad contract that was currently being litigated in a court 3 states away, and a land syndicate, the Consolidated Western Land Company, that had, over the past 4 years, quietly become the largest private landholding entity in the territory. He had all of that. What he didn't have, what he'd realized, sitting in that 3-story house on a Tuesday night in March, staring at a ledger that showed him exactly how much he was worth, which was more than he'd ever intended to accumulate, was a single reason to get up in the morning that he'd chosen for himself. Everything he did had been chosen by momentum, by the logic of more. One deal requiring another, one acquisition opening a door to the next, each decision making perfect sense in isolation while the whole thing became something he'd never actually decided to build. His father had been a rancher, a small operation, barely 60 acres on the eastern slope of the Harrow Range. Cole had worked that land from the time he could walk until the year he turned 16, and a drought, combined with a loan from a company not unlike the one he would one day run, had taken it from them. He'd left, and he'd built something enormous, and he'd done it with a cold, specific efficiency, and somewhere in the middle of building it, he had stopped being able to sleep. He'd come to Ash Creek because of Eliza Thornton's file. 47 ranches had been acquired, some willingly, some less so. Number 48 had been identified, assessed, and offered terms twice. The file on the Thornton property was 4 inches thick. Market value, water rights, access roads, mineral assessments, a full survey. Everything his company needed to make a clean acquisition. He'd read the file at his desk in the Mercer building and stopped at a photograph, a standard property photograph taken from the road. The house, the barn, the fence line, the fields, and a woman standing at the gate, one arm raised not in greeting, but in something that looked closer to defiance, though the photographer had probably not intended to capture that. He'd read her refusal letters. There were 2 of them, short and absolutely final, in a way that made the legal language his acquisition team used look soft. He'd canceled a meeting to read the whole file. Then he'd done something he'd never done in 12 years of building the company. He'd closed the file, put it in a drawer, and left the building. 3 weeks later, he was in Ash Creek with a false name and worn boots. He wasn't sure yet what he'd intended to accomplish. He told himself it was reconnaissance, a hands-on assessment of the property that no surveyor's report could replicate. He told himself a lot of things on that ride out. Most of them were probably not entirely true. What he knew, lying on that cot in the bunkhouse, was that the fence wire on the south section had been cut deliberately, and that his company, the Consolidated Western Land Company, used exactly that kind of technique as a pressure strategy. Not company policy, officially. But the regional manager, a man named Harlan Voss, had a particular approach to resistant landowners that Cole had long chosen to look away from. The looking away had always been easy to justify. He hadn't ordered it. He hadn't known the specifics. The results came in as numbers in columns. Now the results were a row of clean-cut fence wires on Eliza Thornton's south pasture. He stared at the ceiling and listened to the windmill. Fuck. She didn't trust him. That was fine and appropriate, and he didn't try to change it. What shifted over the first few weeks was something more specific than trust. It was reliability. Cole showed up every morning before she did. He was never where she didn't expect him to be. He didn't talk to her like she was a woman who needed to be talked carefully at, which was a thing she'd encountered so many times it had become its own source of exhaustion. He talked to her like a colleague. When he disagreed with her about something, the spacing of posts on the new fence section, the decision to move the cattle to the west pasture instead of holding them, he said so directly and gave his reason, and when she said no, he accepted it and moved on. He was good with her animals. Not showy about it. He just had the particular quiet around them that horses and cattle recognize. Her mare, a touchy gray called Pepper, who'd thrown 2 previous hands, accepted him within a week. She didn't like that she noticed these things. It was a Tuesday in early May, about 6 weeks after Cole arrived, that Eliza first heard the specific name. She'd ridden into Ash Creek to pick up wire and some supplies, and she'd stopped at the hardware store, which doubled as the informal news exchange for the valley. Bill Casey, who'd run the store for 20 years and knew everything about everyone, was in a conversational mood. "You hear about the Hendersons?" he asked, sliding her a box of staples across the counter. "What about them?" "Signed with the Western Land Company. Sold everything. Moving to Fresno, apparently, to live with Doreen's sister." Eliza looked up. "Carl Henderson sold? Signed the papers last week. Nobody saw it coming." "I mean, Carl's been making noises about that offer for a year, but I thought—" Bill shook his head. "He told me they got an offer they couldn't walk away from. But the thing is, Patricia Morrison told me they also had a bad spring. Some kind of issue with their water rights. Upper Creek diversion got blocked somehow. They nearly lost half their summer grazing." He lowered his voice the way he did when he was saying something he couldn't prove. "But a lot of people are saying it didn't get blocked by accident." Eliza set her hands flat on the counter. "How many ranches has this company bought?" "In the valley? The Hendersons make 5. Across the territory." Bill made a gesture that meant he didn't have the number, but it was large. "Who runs it?" "Company, far as I can tell. Calls itself Consolidated Western, out of Crestfield." Bill leaned on the counter. "They've got people, lawyers, agents, nobody with a face you can point to." She drove home thinking about the Henderson place. Carl was a stubborn man, stubborn in the way that's specifically about pride rather than principle, which meant he could be worn down if you found the right pressure point. A blocked water diversion wasn't subtle, but it left no fingerprints. She told Cole about it that evening over the fence posts they were treating on the west side. He listened without interrupting. His expression didn't change in any particular way. He asked her one question. "Do you know who filed the diversion block on Henderson's Upper Creek?" "No," she said. "Do you?" "No," he said, which was technically true, in that he didn't know the specific paperwork, but he knew how the mechanism worked, because he'd approved the mechanism. He picked up another post and drove it into the augured hole. "What would it take to unblock something like that?" she asked. "Depends on what the block was. If it was a legitimate water rights filing, you'd need legal challenge. If it was manufactured, bad paperwork, fraudulent claim, it could come apart faster if someone pushed. The Hendersons already signed. I know. But there are others in this valley who haven't." He looked at her. "Yes." "I'm not signing," she said. It was not said with drama. It was said the way facts are stated. "I know," he said again. They went back to work. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, was that Cole had, 2 weeks earlier, sent a letter. He'd ridden to the post office in Ash Creek on a Thursday morning, early enough that the town was still quiet, and he'd mailed a letter addressed to his personal attorney in Crestfield, not to the company's legal team, but to a private attorney who had handled Cole's individual affairs since before the company existed. A man named George Telford, who was the only person in Cole's life who said what he thought without calculating the consequences first. The letter said 3 things. First, remove the Thornton property from all active acquisition lists immediately. Do not flag. Do not assess. Do not contact. Remove it from the territory report entirely. Second, get me information on Harlan Voss's operational methods in the Valley region. Not what I know officially, what he's actually doing. Third, don't ask me to explain this, just do it. George Telford would do it and would not ask. And then, Cole knew, George would begin to understand that something had shifted in his client's thinking, and he would begin to prepare himself for whatever that meant. June came in hot and dry, the kind of dry that made experienced ranchers quiet and watchful. Cole fixed the windmill bearing. He rebuilt a section of the water system that fed the northeast pasture, which had been losing pressure for months due to a failing joint deep in the line that required someone to dig down 4 feet to reach. He dug it himself, 3 days of work in the heat, came up with cracked hands and a repaired line that ran clean and strong. Eliza watched him work and found it harder and harder to maintain the comfortable distance she'd started with. The trouble with Cole was that he was not what she'd expected a drifter to be. He was not loud or demanding or sentimental. He didn't tell stories about himself. He read. She'd seen him with books from somewhere, she didn't know where, and he had opinions about things that were specific and thought through rather than borrowed. He'd mentioned once, offhandedly, that irrigation systems in the Eastern Territories were moving to a particular design that reduced water loss by a significant percentage, and the way he'd said it suggested he'd read about it in detail, not heard about it from someone at a bar. "Where are you from originally?" she asked him one evening. They were sitting on the fence rails of the east paddock after a long day, the horses grazing in the cooling air. She asked it casually, but she meant it. "Different places," he said. "That's the answer people give